Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the National Archives Know Your Record Lecture Series, presented by the Customer Service Division. For a list of upcoming events, please pick up the calendar of events available at the various kiosks, lecture racks, and online at www.archives.gov. Also, please remember to sign in the back of the room, and please take time to fill out a copy of the evaluation form so we can continue to focus our programs on areas of interest to you. Today's speaker is Reginald Washington. Mr. Washington is an archives/genealogy specialist with the research branch of the National Archives and Record Administration. He lectures frequently on records and research procedures of the National Archives and has served as an African American genealogy subject area specialist at NARA for the past 12 years. Mr. Washington is currently serving as a member of the Editorial Advisory Board for the National Genealogical Society Quarterly. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Washington.
Good morning. Certainly is indeed a pleasure to be here and see we have standing room only. But nevertheless, we want to excited about this presentation, and certainly hopefully when you leave here this afternoon, you'll know a lot more about Freedmen's Bureau records and more specifically Freedmen's Bureau marriage records. Before I actually get into the presentation, at least to the point of talking about the marriage records themselves, I need to discuss the Freedmen's Bureau Preservation Project that has been for the past, well, we completed that project. It was a project where we actually got monies to microfilm the Freedmen's Bureau field office records. And we started that project in 2001, and certainly it was completed in 2006, where we microfilmed all the field office records of the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, basically to better understand that situation, or best way to understand how to use the Freedmen's Bureau records and navigate them and understand why marriage records were created and other kinds of records were created, you need to know how the Bureau was structured. And basically the Bureau began in 1865. Its primary mission was to assist former slaves in making the transition from slavery to freedom. And in doing that, they provided, they were involved in almost every aspect of the freedmen's lives. They issued rations. Certainly after the war, there was destitution among both blacks and whites. They issued rations. They opened up medical facilities, hospitals, dispensaries. They assisted former slaves in transportation efforts. Sometimes persons had been disrupted from their family, either voluntarily or involuntarily. So the Bureau, they would come to the Bureau for assistance to get transportation back to their loved ones. Certainly, the Bureau assisted in terms of providing employment, education. They assisted black soldiers and their family members and their heirs to get back pay, bounty payments, and pensions. Freedmen came to the Bureau to register complaints about how they were treated and how different things were going on with them. And in that vein of all these activities, whether it was rations, labor contracts, complaint records, transportation records, you're going to find records that document the marriage relationship. But more specifically, we do have records that deal exclusively with marriage records as well, because one of the activities that the Bureau was involved in was solemnizing the relationship of those former slaves who married as slaves, and they regularized their marriages, and this was where they issued marriage licenses, certificates, and registered former slaves in their marriages. And we're going to look at some documents from those records and give you some heads up on how to use the records and where some of these marriage records are found. We did an article back in the spring of 2005. It's entitled Sealing the Sacred Bonds of Holy Matrimony. This is the handout we're going to have, but we don't want you to really read it as we go through. Certainly that's something you can read very thoroughly at the end or at your leisure, because it talks more specifically about the marriage records and some of the stuff that we're going to cover here today and where those marriage records are located within the Bureau files. Now, the Bureau basically operated, it had a headquarters in Washington, D.C. Oliver Otis Howard was elected as the commissioner of the Bureau. He had his headquarters in Washington, D.C. He had staff officers broken down in disbursement officers, land officers. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau is actually, official title is the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And basically, it means that not only was the Bureau involved in social activities as it related to former slaves, it's also involved in land activities. During the Civil War, of course, as the military moved into these various areas of the South, particularly all of the southern states and the border states, many of the slave owners would abandon their property, and the Bureau would take over that property. And as the former slaves left the plantation and followed the military, they would put them to work on some of this abandoned land. And so part of their effort, particularly because when the Bureau first started in March of '65, Congress authorized no funds. Can you imagine trying to help nearly 4 million people make the transition from slavery to freedom with no funds to carry out these operations? So they used a lot of the renting and leasing of the abandoned properties and to use the monies to actually carry out some of their projects. So the Bureau had a headquarters in Washington. Oliver Otis Howard was the head. He had various divisions that he opened and officials who worked for him as staff officers. Certainly there in the states, in the former Confederate states and the border states, they had what we call assistant commissioners. The assistant commissioners operated in each of the states and carried out the activities in the states. Down at the local level, they had what we call field office, local field offices. And the local field officers had various staff officers as well, similar to the headquarters and similar to the state assistant commissioner. And in these local field offices are the actual towns and cities where the Bureau operated. And of course, during the process, the local officials would send information up to the state headquarters, and the state headquarters would send information and reports up to the Washington headquarters. Most people came in contact with the Bureau at this local level here, at the towns and at the cities. And for a number of years here at the National Archives, of course, we have inventories and so forth. For a number of years, the field office records that were created at this local level were only available here in Washington, D.C. In other words, someone in California had to come here to actually use the records. So we got an inquiry from Congress where some of their constituents were inquiring why were these records not more available for the nationwide. So we met with Congress and talked to some of the officials there. By and large, they introduced the bill, and later that bill authorized $3 million to microfilm these records. So we began, as I said, in 2001 to microfilm the field office records, which were basically unavailable nationwide. So we had the headquarters, the assistant commissioners, which really served as the state headquarters, and the field offices within the state that covered the various towns and the cities. And so we started on that project. The records are now nearly over 140 years old, and as you can see, they were in bound volumes, and they were in loose papers. You can see how the records were deteriorating. We went through those records, identified things that needed conservation treatment. We had a core of about 50 volunteers who worked with us to unfold the records, place them in acid-free folders, place them in acid-free boxes. We got assistance from the conservation staff. We made customized boxes for these particular boxes. You can see some of them had wraps. They were falling apart. We put them in customized boxes. We measured them. If there was any treatment that was necessary for the actual paper documents, we send them to the conservation lab to receive that treatment. And out of this whole process, once we prepared the records and once the volunteers did their job And we did ours. We did descriptive pamphlets for every one of these microfilm, for every city that was involved, including, as I said, the border states and the former Confederate states. We did descriptive pamphlets that describe what's in the microfilm publication. We organized the records, what's in them, gave background and history. We did research on how the Bureau operated in the various states, Alabama, Tennessee, and certainly any of you used descriptive pamphlets? I know a couple of you have, because I know you've worked with them. But a descriptive pamphlet is going to describe what's on each roll of microfilm for each area where the Bureau operated. You notice I talked about labor contracts, we talked about transportation records. So if somebody was doing research and your research involved a particular state and a particular locality, you could go to that descriptive pamphlet for that state and that particular locality and see what kinds of records survive for your area of research. Now, certainly we historians, social scientists, educators, and more recently, genealogists have begun to take a great interest in these records because of the kinds of documentation that was created. And certainly, we'll see some of that, particularly as it relates to marriage records. And I'll also show examples of how we can take information from one body of records that are going to lead us to others that are here in the National Archives for research. Of course, we sent the material out once we organized it and got it prepared for microfilm, and we sent it out to College Park, out to this area. And of course, we had microfilm camera operators. We had people who we had special cameras to deal with bound volumes. Once the microfilm was done, we double-checked. We made sure that the microfilm publication or the microfilm material was the same as the actual material, the original material. If there was problems, we'd go back through it and do it again. And in my judgment, we did a very fine job. We used some of the state-of-the-art cameras. If you go back and look at some of the microfilm that was done in the early 70s, late 60s, you can see a tremendous difference in the quality of the microfilm. And there's an effort underway now to digitize and index the records. The Genealogical Society of Utah, in collaboration with the Black Museum of Richmond, embarked on a digitization and microfilming project. And they started with the Virginia microfilm, which was one of the largest ones. Microfilm publication was one of the largest. And of course, it was also, last year was the 400th anniversary of Jamestown. So they began with that. And they're looking for volunteers to help out in terms of identifying the records and helping with the digitization and the indexing of the records. And it's going to be a big project. Well, it's already a big project, and certainly the ultimate goal is to do all the states, all of the microfilm material. We supplied the microfilm. They're going to do the digitization and indexing, and ultimately the material is going to be put online. It's going to be free to the general public. Now, of course, out of this project, you remember we talked about the fact that the records weren't available nationwide. So as a result, when we spoke with Congress and had hearings, we said, well, the best way we can make this more accessible, not only microfilm, but make it available throughout all of our regional branches in the National Archives system. We have 13 regional service centers. So we make these microfilm publications for all the states available at our regional branches throughout the United States. We make it also, which is a first, we make it available through our microfilm rental program. Anyone has ever used that microfilm rental program know that the only thing that was available through the National Archives rental program is Census records and Revolutionary War. Well, we got a provision where we're now going to make this available through our rental program as well. So some librarians or other institutions that want to be a part of the rental program can make it available to their constituents in those areas. And of course, they're certainly available at our regional branches around the country. Now, out of that publication, we did about 17 microfilm publications, and we did some extra ones as well. We did a microfilm publication on marriage records. Remember I mentioned how records were bucked up from the local areas and so forth. There were a number of marriage records that we found at the headquarters level, where it had been brought up from the local areas through the assistant commissioners to the headquarters in Washington, D.C. These records over the years has always been used a lot, and of course that impacts the condition of the records. So as a result of the project, we were able to take those headquarters marriage records that were sent to the headquarters and made it into a microfilm publication. There are 5 rolls of microfilm, and of course M1875 is the microfilm publication. Now, of course, the records don't cover every state, and one of the reasons, and I'll get into that a little further, but also there's a handout I believe many of you may have or may not have, is the Black Family Research. In that publication, we did a section on the Freedmen's Bureau, and it identifies all the microfilm publications we produce as it relates to the various states in which the Bureau operated. So if you have relatives or if you're interested yourself in finding out what microfilm publication service is available for Alabama, what microfilm publication is available for any of those states, Louisiana, certainly that's the microfilm publication you want to visit. If you have some questions, certainly I would much prefer that you hold the questions to the end. And I don't want to discourage questions, but we're going to set aside time so that you can answer any questions you might have. So keep that in mind. Now, when we talk about slave marriages, certainly slaves were property, and they certainly couldn't legally marry. But they did marry as slaves. Oftentimes, the marriage situation existed where they would go to the owner and say, hey, we want to be married. So the owner would say, okay, y'all cool, y'all can marry, and you know, they would just go live in a cabin together. So that might have been the extent of the marriage. In some cases, particularly for some of the slaves who lived maybe in the house, they might have a marriage ceremony where they'd have a white preacher or a black plantation preacher say the words over the ceremony, and certainly they would have a big festival and food and all this sort of thing. And we hear that the talk of jumping the broom, where jumping the broom was not actually the marriage ceremony. That wasn't the extent of the ceremony. That was something like the post-nuptial activity. After the marriage had been consummated and the words were said, then they might jump over the broom. There's an interesting story, and I included in there, not necessarily a story, but sometimes they would jump the broom, and if someone, let's say if the bride or the groom failed to get over the broom without knocking it over, then that would determine who would be the boss in the family. And certainly if both were able to successfully jump over the broom, then without knocking it over there was no one was going to be the boss. But we know how that works in reality. But anyway, in some cases you had persons who lived on separate plantations. The wife might live on one plantation and the husband might live on another. You had situations where there might have been more males on one plantation and more females on another. So to keep everybody happy and keep a successful operation going, they would allow men to marry persons on other plantations. If they lived a distance, sometimes they would visit the wife on a weekend. If they lived nearby, they could visit with them daily. So they referred to them as abroad marriages, where the wife lived somewhere else and the husband lived on another plantation. But if there were children, of course, the children were owned by the owner who owned the wife. And certainly, obviously, the husband had no authority over the situation at all. So as a result of these marriages, and we're going to look at some very interesting documents that are going to show that, you know, these people were marrying long before they were being issued licenses and certificates by the Freedmen's Bureau or any of the state governments. Now, one of the earlier records that we have in the Bureau files is an 1861 list of this Reverend L.C. Lockwood, who was a part of the American Missionary Association. You know, during the war, a number of the northern societies, benevolent societies, were coming into the areas. A lot of them had a religious flavor and so forth, and they were concerned about the moral development of the former slaves and so forth, and they came in and they were ministers and they encouraged the federal government and the Army at the time. And of course, the Army had, of course, chaplains and so forth. So in these various departments of the Army that operated out during the military period, certainly they were encouraging the marriages of these former slaves. This happens to be an 1861 report of marriages that Mr. Lockwood was carrying out in the Hampton area. And as you can see, he gives the names of these individuals. There were other, it's a very lengthy list of marriages, and it gives some that were married where persons, blacks, were married at Fortress Monroe. And this is one of the earlier documents that appeared in the Freedmen's Bureau records. Keep in mind that the Bureau, when it came into existence in March of '65, they continued the process that had already been started by the military. And certainly that process continued on. And some of when the Bureau was created, it was created in the War Department. So some of the same individuals who were operating as commanders and officials for the various departments of the Army certainly just went right into some of those Freedmen Bureau positions as well, and then they continued on. So this is one of the earlier documents that we found in the Freedmen's Bureau records documenting that. And normally these departments would send out an order. General Lorenzo Thomas was head of the Department of Tennessee and Arkansas, and he sent out a special order in March of 2864 saying any ordained ministers of the gospel credited by the General Superintendent of Freedmen is hereby authorized to solemnize the rights of marriage among freedmen. And of course, they would issue marriage licenses and instructions on how this activity would be carried out. Then, of course, they would, the Department of Tennessee and Arkansas eventually became the Department of Mississippi, and you can see they had these registers that they created. Now, these registers were created for several reasons. Certainly, they wanted to know who these people were being married, particularly if they were going to eventually have claims against the government. And they wanted to know who they are and what they, so they could match it up with information to prove that these people had been married. Now, as you can see, they provided different kinds of information, certainly the date that the persons were married, the name of the male. Some cases you'll find where some of these individuals were serving with the U.S. colored troops during the Civil War. So you find their company and regiment. You find actually the names of the female. In some cases, a lot of times they'll have the maiden name of the female as well. You can see the value of this from a genealogical standpoint, if that was your ancestor participating in this registration of marriage. Tell where it was taking place, how old the person was, what color they were, what were the color of the mother and father of the male, how many, were they in any previous relationships, and how many years they were in those relationships. Did they have any children as a result? Were their previous relations, how were they separated from their previous relationship? In some cases, you might see death. You might see they were sold away. They did the same thing with the female. And you can see how they're collecting this information so they can use it later. Not only just to register, but to use that information if someone comes and makes a claim against the government, then they can verify the information from one place or another. Now, that happens, we saw there was a marriage record. This is Hamilton Brown. Of course, you can see this is basically saying that he was in the 6 U.S. colored troops. And of course, this register was created at the Mississippi Department level, and it was carried on into the Freedmen's Bureau for Mississippi at the State Assistant Commissioner's level. And of course, this register and the actual marriage license that were issued or certificates were sent to the headquarters in Washington, D.C. And you can see from this, there's Hamilton Brown. It shows what company he was in, the USCT Heavy Artillery. They said his father was 1/4 white, his mother was half white, and they're collecting all this information. In later years, in 1865, I would say by 1867, many of the state legislatures passed laws which recognized the former slaves' marriages and gave instructions on how they should go about, where they should register these marriages, where they should come and record it at the local courthouses or whatever the situation. So the Bureau was pretty much responsible. They took the responsibility of, in those places where there were no laws on the books, or where in some states they might have had laws and certain counties refused to do it, then the Bureau would step in and marry these people and register them, issue licenses and certificates. So we can see here's a register that existed in the assistant commissioner's level. The actual returns were sent to the headquarters in Washington, D.C., and they appear among that microfilm publication that I mentioned to you earlier. Now, also at the, there's a marriage license at the headquarters level for Mr. Hamilton and his wife, Charlotte. And certainly you can see it's a result of this order that the marriage license is being created, that we mentioned that Samuel Thomas ordered for the Department of Tennessee and Arkansas in March 28 of 1864. Now, once the Bureau was actually involved in the activity, Oliver Otis Howard sent out his orders on to his commissioners and all his lower level officials of how this marriage situation would be handled. And he's saying in places where the local statutes make no provisions for the marriage of persons of color, the assistant commissioners are authorized to designate an officer who shall keep a record of the marriage, which may be solemnized by any ordained minister of the gospel. So again, he's saying in places where there's no local statutes or provisions to recognize these former slave marriages, then the Bureau would step in and do it. And this is why we don't have records for every area. In that microfilm publication, for example, we don't have records for South Carolina because apparently the people in South Carolina were carrying it out at the local level. The local officials were. We have one marriage record for Alabama, and we'll see that in that area. Now, once the Howard would issue his orders, then the assistant commissioners would send their orders out to their lower level officials, typical government. Past marriages of freedmen, although often formally solemnized, have not been so authenticated that misconduct can be legally punished or inheritance rightly determined. General remarriage of all persons married without license or living together without marriage should be insisted upon. All probate judges, and of course, in a lot of these areas where the Bureau was operating, there was no local government, so the local officials there came under the authority of the Freedmen's Bureau. It was the only authority in there. So acting as Bureau agents are respectfully requested to dispense with the customary bond and reduce the fees according to the situation of applicants. Circumstances may also dictate a separate book of records. These remarriages should be, as far as possible, private, certainly without festivities. So we see each state, once Howard issued his order, they would send out their orders, and a lot of times it wasn't consistent. And we'll see in some areas they collected more information about the marriage relations than in other areas. This is and I hope that's, this, of course, as I mentioned, and this is why I'm talking about now, we're going to see regular marriage certificates and licenses and so forth. But there, throughout the Bureau's records, there are other bodies of records that document the marriage relationship. Here's an example where an individual is writing the Bureau to say, hey, I want some people to come to, some folks from Salisbury, North Carolina, to come to Alabama, and I'm going to have them work on my plantation and pay them wages and so forth, but I need the Bureau to supply the transportation. So in that vein, when the Bureau supplies, we see in this case, the guy provides the list of those people in Salisbury, North Carolina, who's going to be coming to Alabama to work on his plantation, but you can see that these are family groups. And here's the gentleman, Alfred Walker, and of course it identifies his wife and his daughters and his other children. And of course, even in this situation, his mother is apparently a part of that situation as well. Then of course we see another person where they mentioned that this is a wife. And this is significant because this is a document that was created in 1867. And I don't know how many of you have ever looked at federal census records. In the 1870 census, that's the first census where blacks are becoming out of slavery into freedom, where you first start seeing former slaves being documented in the federal census, particularly slaves. But in that documentation in 1870, they don't identify what the relationships are, the individuals in the household. You may be able to surmise it. You may look at it and say, oh, here's the man, he's 46. Here's a woman, she's 42, assuming that that's the wife, but it doesn't say that's his wife. And those other children in that household are his children. So here's a document prior to the 1870 census that gives you that kind of information and documents the marriage relations in other kinds of records other than licenses and certificates and marriage registers where you can document the marriage relationship and the other Freedmen's Bureau files. This happens to be a register of claims. Remember I mentioned about sometimes the soldiers were killed or killed in action, and the parents and the brothers or the sisters or the wife is coming to the Bureau to get assistance to say, hey, I want to get his back pay, I want to get his bounty money, I want you to give me help in getting a pension for him so I can help support these children. And so they created these registers of these people, and of course you can see even in these registers they're documenting the marriage relationship. Here's Sarah Landman, who's the widow of Benjamin. And of course it gives the company and regiment and so forth of who these individuals are. So these registers or these other kinds of claims records within the Bureau files document the marriage relationship. So certainly you can find that kind of information in various kinds of records. Now, as we can see, I don't know how many of you have used other records in the National Archives, particularly the service records and the pension files that are located downtown. So when we find a document like that, or one of those registers where they say this person was in the military or in the USCT, then we can go and find his service record. We can go find his pension file, which explodes with other kinds of information about him, and I'll show you, we'll see some examples of that as we go through this. Now, here's a register of marriages in Arkadelphia, Arkansas, and it has similar information as we saw in that other file where they're asking about the color, the persons, the names of the individuals. Some of these persons obviously served in the military, their ages. Then, of course, they're asking, do you have any children by previous relationships, that sort of thing. Certainly they identify who the minister, who performed the marriage, and that sort of thing as well. So we can see from a genealogical standpoint how valuable this information would be for someone who's researching their family member who may have resided in Arkadelphia, Arkansas. Also, it gives historians and sociologists a better understanding of what the marriage relationship was like for former slaves, because they're providing information about themselves that document their activities while they were slaves. Of course, there's other marriage certificates in other areas. I'm just showing you some other areas. They're not just at this headquarters level. They're scattered throughout in other areas throughout the files as well. Headquarters is one area where we have marriage registers and marriage reports of marriages and licensing certificates. There are other areas as well. This is another situation in Haleyondale County, Arkansas, where they're documenting the marriage of several individuals. Again, there's a register for Missouri, where you can see where Missouri is collecting less information. So they weren't consistent in terms of how they collected information. Some collected more information than others, where we saw in the earlier registers where they were talking about the color of the parents and the color of the wife's, the female's parents, and how long they've been in a relationship and how they were so, well, some of them don't give as much information. So it wasn't always consistent. This is a register, a marriage register for the District of Columbia. And of course, we see how in certain places they did different things a different way in other areas. Well, in DC, they had a superintendent of marriage. So they had a whole superintendent division set up for marriages alone. And this is a register for the District of Columbia. And if you look closely, particularly at the former residents of these individuals, a lot of the persons who are coming to the District of Columbia are coming from surrounding areas, Prince George's County, various areas in Virginia. So if you were looking for marriage records and you knew your ancestor lived in these areas, Prince George's County and so forth, well, you might not want to look at the records for Maryland. You might want to look at the ones for DC, because that's where you're going to find people coming from those local close areas. Now you can see they're giving the names of the minister, and of course the first and last names of the maiden names of the bride, and certainly where they're coming from. There's other information by whom they were married. Then they make remarks on the side about the particular marriage relationship, and some of them amusing and some are not so amusing. But what's really interesting is this column here. This register was created in 1866, December of 66. Look at what these people were saying when I was married. I was married in 1836 as a slave. This is they're documenting the actual slave marriage. When did that take place? I was married in 1841. We were married since 1858. We were married since 1836. So these people, although they were being issued these marriage licenses and certificates and were being registered, they considered themselves married long before then. And they were telling the bureau officials that this is when we were married. And in some instances, and we'll see other examples, this is a marriage certificate that was issued in Kentucky. And you can see the bureau's letterhead, and it's in John and Emily Porter. It lists the children. I don't know any marriage license where you're going to have the children listed with their age. And this is an 1866 document. Now, look at what they say here. We have this appeared before me under the oath, acknowledging that they have been living together as man and wife since 28th day of May, 1844. So they're telling you that, hey, we got married. I know this license says 1866, but we were married in 1844. So if you find a document like that that's your relative, there's nowhere else you're going to find a document like that tells you about a slave marriage. Now, this is another document here where order was issued by the assistant commissioner in Kentucky, giving these, if you read the order, it'll tell you pretty much what the circumstance. And this is B.B. Manson and Sarah Ann White. And they've been married since October 28, 1843. And it lists the children here. Lists their ages. And not only that, it says, too, the children served in the military. So from what I've been telling you here today and what many of you know about the National Archives, now I can go and find their service record. I can find their pension record and might discover some other information about this family and Miss Sarah and B.B. Manson. Now, I did indeed. I looked through the service record for these persons. This is the service record for one of the sons. Hopefully that's didn't go too far. What am I doing? Going too fast. Gotta go back. Okay, this is one of the service records of one of the sons. Now, keep in mind, B.B. Manson, Sarah Ann White. B.B. Manson and Sarah lived on separate plantations. So when the sons went into the military, some took the White name and some took the Manson name. So you can see how complicated it can get. And of course, here's one of the sons, John White. It gives the information. We verify that it's the same unit and everything. Then we go look at the pension, and this is a pension index form. We go and look at the pension index, and we see that John White is an alias. His actual name is John Manson. Now, it's the person that appeared on this marriage certificate. So we find now that he used two names. He used John White as an alias, and his actual name was John Manson. In the case of John White, he died in combat, he died from the measles while in the service, but his father, Benjamin B.B. Manson, came to get his pension as this son being the sole support of the family. So he's applying for a pension and received a pension as a result of his son who died from the measles, and we see there's Benjamin Manson, and of course we see his son going in under an alias and a different name. We go and find the other son that was listed there. There he is, and he's going under the name of Martin Clark. His name was Martin Clark Manson, but he went in the service as Martin Clark. But when you go to looking for him as a pension, you see his alias is Martin Clark, but his actual name is Martin Manson. So you can see where they lived on separate plantations. Some took the name of Manson, some took the name of the mother. And of course, when we go to actually look at the pension file, we find some incredible information about Manson, the father, who's coming in to say, look, I'm 83 years of age, I reside in Lebanon, Tennessee. I'm the identical B.B. Manson who claims pension as the dependent father of John White, who was a soldier in the colored regiment in the Civil War. My son John White died in service of measles. John's mother was Sarah White. We were married on Dr. L.W. White's farm, 5 miles from Lebanon, Tennessee. Reverend Benjamin White, colored, said the marriage ceremony. The wedding ceremony took place on the porch of the owner of Sarah. It was with the knowledge and consent of my master, Joseph L. Manson, who was Sarah, his mother was the original owner, and Sarah's master that we were married. Dr. L.W. White brought me after our marriage. He had me for a number of years. Then Mr. Manson brought me back and owned me until I was emancipated. So from that marriage license, we found a service record. We found a pension record. Within the pension record, we found exactly how these people got married. So here's where one document led us to another document that provided some vital information about the person. If that was my ancestor or someone, certainly I would be very excited about finding a document like that. Now, also in the pension file, it says that, hey, one of his youngest sons served in the military too. It wasn't listed on there, but his son served later, after 1866, in the regular army, the Buffalo Soldiers and all those people. So here's a son, a younger son, who appears on that list, that marriage register. He served in the military too, fighting in the West against the Native Americans. And certainly he was in the regular army. So there's a whole slew of, he re-upped a couple of times. He served with the 24th Regiment Infantry, and then he served with the 25th. And all that was found out based on that one marriage record that led us to another record, that led us to another record, that led us to another record within the National Archives, where there's information about this person's family and their activity. Now, we talked about labor contracts within the Freedmen's Bureau. The Bureau assisted former slaves rather than getting this 40 acres and a mule that people talk about. Certainly Andrew Johnson in 1828, in December of 1865, effectively returned the land back to the former owners. So certainly these people had to go to work now. So the Bureau oversaw these labor contracts, sometimes between the former owner or whoever was leasing the property and other individuals. So we know that Manson was living in a certain area. I could go to the microfilm for Tennessee and see if he or his family are involved with labor contracts. So if we look here, down at the bottom here, there's B.B. Manson and his wife Sarah working under a labor contract with J.M.E. Merritt and Robert Sanders. The men are being paid between $10 and $12 a month, and the women are being paid $6 per month. So we can see where we could take information. Although we found a marriage record, they might have had other contact with the Bureau. Maybe they received rations. Maybe they signed a labor contract. Maybe they made a complaint. Maybe they did something in terms of trying to get transportation or whatever the case may be. So the Bureau files may document that family somewhere else as well. Now, from the Bureau file, from the pension file, we found out about Manson's brother. So what I'm going to do, let's go look and see if his brother had contact with the Bureau. Well, the brother got married too. So we're finding not the Manson marriage record and his family, we're finding his brother and his family as well. He talks about his wife, his first wife, second wife, who he had children by, and so forth and so on. So from that record, we not only found about Manson and his family, we found his brother, and we also found his daughter, who married under another name. So we were able to collect not only his brothers and nephews, we also found other information about his wife and who she married. Here she's saying Nancy Jane, formerly belonged to Barry White, was the daughter of B.B. Manson. So not only did he and his brother get married, but his daughter was married as well through the Freedmen's Bureau. And actually, in the pension file, we found out that Mr. Manson was also an ordained minister, later became one. And he married some of these people who lived in his community. So a wealth of information from one marriage record led us to another kind of record. Of course, this is just to show that there's other marriage records as well in Louisiana. There's a marriage register. As I said, that article that we wrote back in '05 will bear that out, will tell you where other stuff is and so forth. But as you can see, they collected different kinds of information. Maybe not as much information in some cases, but information nonetheless. Here's a register. It identifies this person, Isaac McLean, his wife. Of course, we pulled that out to make a point, because in the headquarters records, there's a marriage license, marriage certificate for this individual. And we can see this actual license was issued to these individuals as well, who appeared on this register. Now, in South Carolina, sometimes because when the Bureau first started, they didn't have enough assistant commissioners. I told you they didn't have money, so they didn't have assistant commissioners to cover every state. So one commissioner might be responsible for several states. Until that state later got monies, and certainly they put a commissioner in Georgia and Florida as well. But before then, Georgia and Florida were under South Carolina. So the South Carolina Assistant Commissioner issued marriage rules. These are the rules that are going to be under which these former slaves can marry. Here, all married persons who shall furnish satisfactory evidence of either the marriage or divorce of a former companion according to the usage of slavery or their decease will be eligible to marry. Certainly, you know, people could be, we talked about earlier, people could be sold away from their relatives. If the husband was sold away or the wife was sold away, well, the guy might go get another wife later, never thinking he'll see that person again. So they're talking about providing, you know, evidence of that nature. All married persons producing satisfactory evidence of having been separated from their companions by slavery for a period of 3 years, and that they have no evidence that they are alive, or if alive, that they will ever probably be restored to them, may be allowed to marry again. Any society of the church having an ordained minister may delegate to him its power to examine applicants and grant permits for marriage. Such power, however, may be revoked at any time. Civil officers may give permits for marriages if the laws of the state provide the same, and such laws are recognized as enforced by the general government. This, of course, is another marriage license for Tallahassee, Florida. Tallahassee was under martial law, so in some instances the provost marshal would marry these folks. And this happens to be William Franklin, and they're in Leon County with Della Dent. They're both in Leon County and so forth, and they're being issued a marriage record. Actually, yesterday I had never done this, but I looked at a bank record, the Freedmen's Bank, which was set up at the same time that the Bureau was set up. It was set up for former slaves to open up bank accounts. Now, I've been, you know, when I was in school, I never heard of a Freedmen's Bank or a Freedmen's Bureau. But blacks former slaves will open up bank accounts. And when they open up these accounts, they provided a good deal of information about themselves. Show you an example of that. And I discovered just yesterday, when I just happened to be looking, I said, let me check Frank. Found out, of course, they opened up a bank account. So I looked under the Franklin name and found his wife and so forth, and the wife identified who her parents were. Then I looked under one of the sons that they had from the relationship, certainly had a bank account, and they mentioned who their, who the grandparents were. So there's other records. This happens to be an application for rations. Remember, I mentioned that the Bureau was assisting people with giving them rations, to keep people from starving and whatever. And in this case, in Florida, they would, if a plantation owner, once they leased this property from the Bureau or whatever, would agree to set aside 10 acres for these individuals that work for him to run, to build, to plant stuff for themselves, then the Bureau would say, okay, you don't have to issue them rations, we'll issue. But they have to come to us and apply for it. So in this case, here's Washington Davis applying for rations based on the fact that he's working for this guy Peeler as on his plantation, and of course that application lists again the children and documents the marriage relationship. This again is a document that was created in 1866 prior to the 1870 census, which doesn't identify relationships and families. So it's an important document that does show indeed these people. And this is what a bank record looks like. This is the bank record for Washington Davis. And as you can see, it just tells when he opened the account, where he lived, how old he was, who his wife was, Jane, what the children's names were, their ages, place of birth. He wasn't born in Florida. He migrated for whatever reason, or however reason, he migrated from Georgia to Florida. He gives information about, he's renting a place from this lawyer that we saw in the application. So it lists other members of the family as well, brothers and sisters and so forth. Now, sometimes in the marriage relationship, some of these people who were married as slaves didn't want to continue to be married. Maybe the marriage was forced upon them, I don't know. But they'd come to the Bureau and try to settle these things, and the Bureau officials would go to the headquarters and say, hey, I got this problem, how do I deal with it? Sir, the act establishing and enforcing the marriage relations between persons of color passed by the General Assembly, approved by the Governor of Florida in January last, provides in what manner free people who were living as man and wife before emancipation, who mutually desire to continue in that relationship, shall legalize their marriage, but fails to prescribe how cases are to be disposed of, wherein the parties opposed to being regularly joined in the bonds of matrimony. Madison Davis and Maria Richards, both colored, were living together as man and wife for 7 years. During the time, 3 children were born. Both husband and wife refused to legalize their relationship, and both claimed the children. I must confess that I'm at a loss to decide which one of the two is to have the children, or what the disposition is to be made of the children. Neither husband nor wife seems to be in condition to provide for the children. Still, both appear to have an affectionate regard for the children, and each loudly demands them. I will thank you to lay this case before the Assistant Commissioner for the State of Florida for his consideration and decision. So they're coming to tell us, how do we handle this situation? And in this situation, believe it or not, they said that the children belong to the man. Back during that you're talking about what, 19th century, man owned everything, including the children, so to speak. But you see some of the modern day thing, but you see some of that now, but most of the time the children are left with the mother. But in this case, so what's interesting, and we can use other records, we go to the 1870 census, and this was in 1867, and the family is living together. They decided not to break up. So they stayed to this day, and all of them stayed there. Remember, they had affectionate regard for the children, so cheaper to keep her. Now, the following agreement, this is a labor contract, and we still document the American marriage relation. Here's the following agreement or contract is this day made between Andrew Walthour and Company of the first part, and Simon Walthour the second part, for himself Effie Walthour, his wife, so they're documenting the relationship of marriage in this labor agreement. Jenny Walthour, Flora, Hannah, his daughters, Simon, $10 per month, Effie $6 per month, Jenny $6 per month, Flora $2 per month, Hannah $2 per month. Agrees for himself and each member of his family to contract that they will work faithfully for said Andrew Walthour and Company for the year 1867 upon the above terms and conditions. Simon also further agrees that should either himself or any member of his family in this contract at any time during the year leave the work for 1 day without permission of Andrew Walthour, he shall forfeit all rights and claims to any money remaining in their possession by reason of retention of 2/3 of the pay for each month of such delinquent members, and to claim no right to be or have them employed by them, so forth, for the balance of the year. So it not only documents the marriage relationship, it tells you the conditions under which these labor contracts were enforced and what the provisions were for the contractee and the contractor. Some of these contracts were for share the crop. We know about sharecropping and how that system worked. So sometimes the money, the contracts were for cash, sometimes they were for shares of the crop. Now, here's another situation where somebody's coming to complain. Easter Moore, freedwoman, being duly sworn, deposes and says that she and one York Moore, her husband, as she vehemently believes, have cohabitated together for a number of years, that she has 3 children begotten by York Moore, that York Moore has always recognized said children as his children, and Dependent further alleges that sometime in the fall of the year of 1866, said York left her and commenced living in the state of adultery with one Rena Waters, and that said York is at the present time living in adultery with this lady. So it wasn't all just complaining about being abused by other people. And of course, this is certainly just a military claim where someone is coming to make a claim against the government and it's documenting the marriage relationship as well. This is something that's coming to the Bureau, and they providing a marriage license and a marriage certificate as evidence of being married to this person and so forth. Again, this is a report of marriages. Sometimes they just reported about marriages they performed. This happens to be one in Charlotte, North Carolina, and it lists the individuals in the household, the marriage parties who are applying for these licenses. Now, if you're doing North Carolina research, certainly there's a book called Somebody Knows My Name, where Miss Bonetta McGee White produced a publication that identifies by county blacks who married during a certain period, and it's been published. I think she went into the courthouses and gleaned this information. I didn't see anything for Raleigh. That's why I put that Raleigh document up there, because I didn't see anything representing the county for Raleigh. So maybe there was no evidence there at the time that she did the research, but there is evidence that people were at least applying for licenses during the period. This again is another complaint register where a person is coming complaining to the Freedmen's Bureau about someone not behaving or whatever. And this is really what the complaint, this is Lousie McTonigan and Abner McTonigan. Louisa complains that Abner, after living 4 years with and after having 4 children by him, deserted her and took up with another woman. The evidence in this case, and this is the Bureau making the judgment, evidence in this case showed that Louisa was the lawful wife of Abner. In obedience to Circular Number 9, Abner was told to live with her and take care of the children or be tried in civil court. And they use this as the following regulation: no marriage or connection recognized as such shall be dissolved except for due process of law. Persons cohabitating together or associating as man and wife according to the uses of the country in the past and recognize such according to the Act of Congress approved by whatever. Again, this is another register for Louisa County in Virginia, and it details the act that established the recognition of the slave marriages, and people had to register their marriages at certain courthouses and so forth. But again, if a certain county wasn't doing it, then the Bureau would step in and do it. So maybe that was the case with Louisa. And I think at some point, some of the Bureau marriage records may have been turned over once the Bureau left to the state government. So it may be some duplication, and then it may not be, it may not have been turned over. And the only place you're gonna find that marriage documentation for a former slave is in the Freedmen's Bureau files. Now, of course, we talked about the article that I suggest you read that to get a better understanding of the entire situation and where there are other marriage records. And of course, there's a National Genealogical Society quarter. Christopher Nordman did another very nice article on marriage, slave marriages and documenting slave marriage. And a lot of the areas where he talked about in that article were not necessarily Freedmen's Bureau records, were other areas where you can find slave marriages and document those kinds of marriages. I'll entertain any questions. About a couple of minutes before 12, according to that. I'll entertain any questions you might have about Freedmen's Bureau marriage records or genealogy in general or whatever. Yes, ma'am. You have a question?
Did the application for Freedmen's help from the Freedmen's Bureau apply to slaves that were free, to blacks that were free prior to emancipation?
The question, well, you heard the question, did the application apply? Well, as you can see, the Bureau, as I said, it was taking over the same responsibility that the military had been doing prior to the Bureau coming into existence. We did another publication called Pre-Bureau Records. Within the Bureau records, you'll find records that were created prior to the Bureau coming into existence. Like some of those marriage registers you looked at, they began in 1864, but the Bureau didn't come into existence till March 65. There's other records that are in many of the states where there's interspersed in the regular files that are predating the Bureau, because it's the activity being carried over into the Bureau's period by people who served as military officials and later became Bureau officials. So you do find that pre-stuff in there as well. Any other questions? I'm sure it is. Yes?
Are these just the ones that were forwarded up to headquarters, or are these indeed the field office records?
The only thing that was forwarded up to the headquarters were, when I showed some of the earlier ones, when I pointed out other registers and other stuff, those were coming from the field offices. Some of these other documents where, some of the letters that are talking about relationships and how people did this and that, some of the other registers that I showed were certainly not just stuff that was at headquarters level. They were stuff that's available throughout. And once you look at that article, you'll see, you go and look at Louisiana, and you'll see, oh, they have some records for Joe Blow County. They have some for this county, for that county, this city, that city. So, yeah, some of the examples I showed were from other, excuse me, other areas as well, among the Bureau files. So, another hand. Yes?
Before you, when you have a question, could you please wait for the mic, because we're recording in the back and we cannot hear you.
Okay.
All right. My question sort of tails off of her question. If there was a Freedmen's Bureau in Columbus, Mississippi, would any of those records still be like in the county courthouse, or would they all have been transferred here?
Okay, you heard the question. Well, it's possible that someone was in the county courthouse, because see, when the legislature passed the law, they probably told them to go to the local courthouse and register your marriage. See what I mean? So some people went there, and some counties complied. Then you might have gone to some counties, and they would say, well, I don't care what the law is, I'm not doing it. So the Bureau would do it. So sure, there are going to be some of these marriage records relating to former slaves that are going to appear in the county, because, again, we don't have them for every state. We don't have any marriage records for South Carolina, so most of the people were going to the local, the the law said go to your local official, go to the local courthouse and register your marriage. So the Bureau might send out a circular and tell the former slaves, look, you need to go register your marriage at the local courthouse. They passed a law in there, go do it. And if the Bureau saw that some area was not doing it, then they would go do it. So there could be stuff in the courthouses, stuff that's not in the Bureau files, and maybe there's something in the Bureau files that's not in the courthouse file. Any other questions? Yes.
I've enjoyed your presentation, Reggie. I found it very educational. But is any of this information online, or do we have to come to the main building to get access to these records? Are we scanning any of this information, or is it?
I mentioned earlier.
I'm sorry. Did I miss it?
In the unit,
Oh.
the Genealogical Society of Utah has embarked on a huge project, starting with your state, to digitize and index the Freedmen's Bureau records for Virginia. Last year was the 400th anniversary. So they've started with Virginia, and the whole idea is to digitize and index all the state's material because we gave them the microfilm. And eventually they're gonna put all of that stuff online, free.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
One of the first records that you showed identified a pastor, being documented in that record, and you said he was part of the American Missionary Association.
Yes.
Do they always identify what group, if a pastor is listed, what religious affiliation he is, or any kind of affiliation?
Not necessarily. In that particular case, they did mention that, this guy, because he was operating there in Fortress Monroe under the auspices of the American Missionary Association, but not always. Some of the ministers are people who are actually chaplains in the military or something of that nature, or could be regular local ministers, but it doesn't necessarily show their affiliation. Now, that's basically in the registers sometimes you see, but there could be documentations in letters and other stuff where they're actually saying who these ministers are and under what association or organization they represent. So it could be the documentation could be there, sure.
Hi, Reggie. You mentioned in your talk a lot of these marriages are parts of various microfilm publications.
Yeah.
Have all the marriage records that are in the Bureau, have all of them been microfilmed as part of a publication, or are there still more that are necessary that we have to go down and actually look at the records?
As I mentioned before, we did a separate marriage publication where all of these records had culminated. Some of these marriage records were coming from the assistant commissioners in the local areas and culminated at the headquarters level. But as we went through the entire microfilming effort from Alabama to Virginia, during that effort, we came across other marriage records within those other or part of those other publications. In that article that I mentioned, we identified where those things are. So if you read that article, you'll see, down to the specifics as to what city or county those records are and what, in the other publication. And of course, that article will spell it out, and certainly in there, in this publication, we give the M numbers for all of the various states that were microfilmed, so you'll know where to go and look. Yes.
In listening to your presentation, I got the sense that one of the major benefits of marriage at this time was perhaps the moral side from the religious community.
Yes.
At least they were promoting it. I'm curious to know whether there are other benefits gained
Yes.
as a result of former slaves being able to marry.
I don't know if you were in on the earlier one when we saw that register, and we talked about the other benefits was, number one, the government was concerned about people making claims against the government, so they wanted that data, that information that they could refer back to and verify that this person was indeed married to this person. And there's other personal information that was collected to help them to do that. Also, you talked about inheritance. You know, when you start dealing with inheritance and all these other things, you gotta show legal documentation that you were married. There was a situation where this one young lady, former slave, she came before the federal court and said, look, my mother married this guy as a slave. My mother died. The guy remarried, had children, and he died. So she was filing for some of the inheritance, and the court ruled in her favor. It was no fault of hers that they could not marry legally. She married as a slave. He married her mother. The mother died. No fault of hers. She's a offspring of that relationship, and so the court ruled that she was entitled to that some part of that inheritance of the man who remarried and had other children. So that was interesting in itself, that they recognized that. So inheritance was one thing, claims against the government, and other things where you know, you have to use marriage as a legal means to get something, whether it's a pension or something of that nature. So there were other benefits. They were becoming citizens now. They had to be just like anybody else making a legal claim. They had to prove that you were married to this person, that you were the offspring of this relationship and so forth. So it was a lot of benefits. Any other questions? No questions? Thank you for coming. I certainly hope you encourage others to take a look at these records, and you'll find them very fascinating, even if it's just, you know, your children who want to do papers or, you know, for school and stuff like that. A lot of the schools now are requiring these youngsters to use primary sources. Kids come in there with primary sources opposed to something they got out of a book. Guess who's going to get the A?
Excuse me, before you leave, could you please take the survey and